McConnell popped it up. 3 pitches later, history landed softly in a glove, and Detroit erupted into a sound it hadn't made in a generation. The Tigers were world champions, and the cameras immediately searched for a face that didn't quite fit the script everyone had prepared. Not the golden boy, not the headline ace. Instead, they found Mickey Lolich, Michael Stephen Lolich, being lifted, hugged, almost awkwardly celebrated, as if the city itself was still processing what had just happened. This was how Detroit would remember him forever, or at least, how it told itself it would. In 1968, Lolich was 28 years old, a left-handed starter who had spent most of the season operating in the long shadow of Denny McLain. McLain was the phenomenon, the 31-game winner, the pitcher the nation talked about. Lolich was the other guy, the reliable one, the one who took the ball when asked and didn't ask many questions in return. And yet, when the moment arrived, when the Tigers needed something beyond the plan, it was Lolich who stepped forward, not loudly, not dramatically, just effectively. To understand why that mattered so much, you have to rewind far past 1968, back to a childhood accident that quietly rewired a future. Lolich wasn't born left-handed. He entered the world on September 12, 1940, in Portland, Oregon, throwing with his right hand like almost every other kid. Then, at age 3, riding a tricycle, he collided with a parked motorcycle that tipped over onto him. The result was a broken left collarbone, a cast, and months of rehabilitation. When the cast came off, his parents made a decision that seemed practical at the time, but would echo for decades. They strapped his right arm down to force him to strengthen the injured left one. Lolich would later believe that moment, painful, accidental, unintended, shaped his entire career. It wasn't destiny, it was improvisation, the kind of improvisation that defined him again and again. As a teenager, Lolich pitched in Babe Ruth League and American Legion baseball, winning championships and building a reputation that wasn't flashy but undeniable. At Portland's Lincoln High School, scouts noticed something familiar: durability. Detroit Tigers scouts signed him in 1958 for $30,000. A solid bonus that came with an unspoken expectation you climb the system, follow instructions, and fit the mold. Lolich did none of that particularly well. In the minor leagues, his independent streak quickly became obvious. He bristled at authority, refused a demotion at one point, and simply flew home. He showed up late to spring training once, not because of partying or rebellion, but because he'd taken the civil service exam. He was considering becoming a letter carrier if baseball didn't work out. That detail, almost mundane, tells you more about Mickey Lolich than any stat line ever could. He loved pitching, but he didn't worship the game. To him, baseball was a job, and jobs sometimes failed you. Eventually, in May 1963, he reached Detroit. The Tigers didn't get a polished star. They got a workhorse. Lolich pitched a lot of innings, struck out a lot of batters, and rarely complained. He became, almost unintentionally, the embodiment of Detroit itself: blue-collar, durable, slightly rough around the edges. His unusual physique, including a slight beer belly, endeared him to fans who were tired of sculpted heroes. Lolich leaned into it, mockingly calling himself the beer drinker's idol. But behind the humor was economic reality. Baseball salaries weren't what they would become, and Lolich wasn't among the game's elite earners anyway. So he joined the Michigan National Guard when the Detroit riots erupted in 1967. The Guard called him up, and Lolich left the team to patrol the city's chaotic streets. Some criticized him for leaving the club, others quietly respected it. Either way, it reinforced the truth: Mickey Lolich lived in the real world, not the romanticized one fans preferred. The Tigers' painful 1967 pennant loss to the Red Sox hardened the organization. In 1968, they came back ruthless and focused. Behind McLain's improbable 31 wins, Detroit went 103-59. With 40 comeback victories that defined their season, they cruised to the pennant, ending a 23-year championship drought. The locker room celebration was wild, cathartic, emotional. Lolich, however, sounded almost reflective. He talked about the minor leagues, about how the entire club had come through the Tigers' system together. There was pride there, but also perspective. Then came the World Series. The defending champion Cardinals took Game 1. Pressure crept in immediately. Game 2 went to Lolich. He pitched and won, flashing dominance that forced people to reconsider who the series might belong to. But the moment everyone remembered wasn't a strikeout. It was a swing. Lolich, one of the worst hitters in Major League history by batting average, hit a home run, his first ever, with 2 strikes. He barely believed it himself. When he reached first base, he looked like he might turn around and walk back to the plate. He would never hit another home run in his career. Later, with his trademark self-deprecation, he joked that it was the great pitching ability of Nelson Briles hitting his bat instead of him hitting the ball. As the series continued, Detroit found itself down 3-1. Lou Brock ran wild. Bob Gibson loomed. In Game 5, Lolich gave up 3 early runs, and it looked like the moment had finally swallowed him. Then Willie Horton's throw to Bill Freehan cut Brock down at the plate, igniting controversy and momentum. Game 6 was a rout, 13 runs for Detroit, which left Game 7. Mayo Smith asked Lolich the unthinkable. Could he pitch on today's rest? Lolich said yes, maybe 5 innings, then one more, then another. When it was over, the Tigers had completed one of the greatest comebacks in World Series history. Lolich was the MVP. A ticker tape parade followed. One fan joked about running him for president, and then, almost immediately, the noise faded, because that's where Mickey Lolich always lived, in the space between celebration and routine. Greatness and normalcy, the city had its hero. The question was how long it would remember why. If Game 7 made Mickey Lolich immortal in Detroit, the years that followed quietly reminded everyone how fragile that immortality could be. Baseball has always had a short memory, especially for players who don't fit clean archetypes. Lolich wasn't a flame-throwing prodigy, wasn't a sculpted ace built for magazine covers, and he wasn't particularly interested in selling a myth about himself. He showed up, took the ball, and absorbed whatever the game demanded. In the aftermath of 1968, that attitude became both his strength and his burden. The Tigers entered 1969 as defending champions, but the world around them had shifted. Baseball itself was changing. Expansion diluted pitching staffs. The mound would soon be lowered. Off the field, America was tense, divided, and restless. Detroit, still scarred from riots and economic strain, no longer looked at sports as an escape so much as a mirror. And in that mirror, Mickey Lolich remained stubbornly unchanged. He kept pitching deep into games, piling up innings in a way that would be considered reckless today. Managers trusted him because he didn't break, at least not visibly, but the cost was real. His arm absorbed workloads that modern analytics would call unsustainable. He led the league in strikeouts multiple times, not always as a compliment. He also led in innings pitched, a badge of honor then, a warning sign now. Lolich didn't pace himself because no one had taught pitchers to do that yet. The job was simple: get outs, then get more. Detroit fans loved that. They saw themselves in it. Factory shifts didn't end early because you were tired. Neither did baseball games. But the league's perception of Lolich remained complicated. For all the World Series glory, he was still viewed as inconsistent. Dominant one night, hittable the next. He could strike out 16 batters and still lose. He could give up a crooked number early and then settle in, forcing his offense to catch up. He was never quite tidy enough for baseball's historians, never efficient enough for purists. By the early 1970s, that tension became impossible to ignore. Lolich was still effective, still respected in clubhouses, but Detroit was sliding. Losing seasons piled up, attendance dipped, and the economic reality of baseball players, especially those who weren't superstars, grew harder to ignore. Lolich, who had already joined the National Guard earlier in his career, never stopped thinking about life after baseball. He wasn't cynical. He was practical. That practicality shaped one of the most misunderstood chapters of his career. In 1976, the Tigers traded Lolich to the New York Mets. For many fans, it felt like a quiet dismissal of a man who had given them everything. For Lolich, it was confirmation of something he'd always suspected. Loyalty in baseball only runs one direction. The Mets stint was brief, followed by a stop with the San Diego Padres. By then, the game was younger, faster, and less patient with pitchers who worked by feel instead of velocity spikes. When Lolich retired after 16 seasons, his numbers were substantial: minus 117 wins, 2,830 to strikeouts, over 3,600 innings pitched. But numbers weren't what followed him. What followed him was silence. There was no Hall of Fame push, no sustained national campaign. His legacy lived mostly in Detroit, and even there, it softened with time. Younger fans knew the name, but not the weight. That's often the fate of players whose greatness peaks in a single defining moment. They become symbols, not subjects. Lolich didn't fight that. He didn't chase broadcasting jobs or endorsement deals. Instead, he bought a donut shop in Lake Orion, Michigan, and then he worked there. Not as an absentee owner, as a man behind the counter. It was almost absurdly on brand. The same pitcher who once shut down the Cardinals on 2 days rest now woke up early to make coffee and sweep floors. When people asked him about 1968, he didn't deflect, But he didn't romanticize it either. He talked about cleaning up his yard the day after the parade, about how celebration felt good, but life still waited. That grounded honesty made him beloved by those who met him later, even if they only knew him as the donut guy. In hindsight, Lolich's career raises uncomfortable questions about how baseball values labor. He pitched through pain in an era that normalized it. He delivered under pressure without demanding control or leverage. He accepted that some seasons would be wasted by circumstances beyond his control. And when the game moved on, he didn't protest. He adapted. That doesn't make his story tragic. It makes it honest. Because the truth is, Mickey Lolich represented a version of baseball that no longer exists, one where durability mattered more than dominance, where identity mattered more than image. He was never marketed as a legend. He became one by accident, through necessity, at the exact moment his team and his city needed someone like him. And that's where the tension lingers. Was Mickey Lolich underrated, or was he perfectly rated for what he was, a great pitcher, not a transcendent one, whose greatest value came when circumstances demanded resilience over brilliance? The answer depends on what you believe baseball should reward. What remains undeniable is that when Detroit needed him most, he didn't hesitate. He didn't negotiate rest. He didn't ask for protection. He simply said yes, and that yes echoed longer than anyone expected. Time has a way of sanding down careers until only a few sharp edges remain. For Mickey Lolich, those edges were always obvious to Detroit and oddly invisible everywhere else. As the years passed, his story drifted into a strange middle ground, too big to forget, too quiet to constantly remember. Baseball moved forward, radar guns got louder, pitch counts became sacred, and the kind of pitcher who simply took the ball and refused to give it back began to feel like a relic from another industrial age. Yet inside clubhouses, among pitchers who understood what the job actually cost, Lolich's name never vanished. He was referenced the way workers reference someone who carried more than his share without complaint. Not glamorous, not flashy, reliable in a way that doesn't translate well to highlight reels. Younger pitchers heard stories about him throwing until his arm went numb, about finishing games because no one else was coming, about taking responsibility for losses without blaming defense or run support. These weren't myths. They were habits. The modern game would not have been kind to Mickey Lolich. That isn't an insult. It's an acknowledgement. His value was built on endurance in an era that treated endurance as currency. Today, endurance is risk. His beer-belly image, once embraced by fans as proof of authenticity, would now be dissected by training staffs and social media analysts. His willingness to pitch on short rest would be flagged by algorithms before his manager could even ask. But that contrast is precisely why his story has aged so well. Lolich's career forces a reevaluation of what greatness looked like when stripped of marketing. He didn't dominate a decade. He didn't redefine mechanics. He didn't collect awards in bulk. What he did was answer the most uncomfortable question in sports. What happens when everything depends on you and there is no perfect option? In 1968, the answer was simple. You pitch, you keep pitching. You accept the consequences later. That mentality carried into his post-baseball life. Lolich never spoke bitterly about money, despite earning a fraction of what pitchers with far less workload would later make. He acknowledged it plainly. Timing matters. Eras matter. He once joked that if he'd come along a few decades later, things might have looked very different. But the joke never carried resentment. It carried acceptance. That acceptance is what separated him from the bitterness that swallowed many former players. He didn't need validation from plaques or committees. His validation came from moments that couldn't be taken away, from teammates who remembered him showing up when others couldn't, from a city that still recognized his face years after the last pitch, from ordinary customers who slowly realized the man handing them a donut once carried a championship on his left arm. When Lolich passed away, the reaction was telling. There was no sudden revisionist rush to crown him something he wasn't. Instead, there was respect, quiet, sincere respect. Former players talked about how hard he was to face. Writers talked about how much baseball had changed since his prime. Fans talked about where they were when he won Game 7. Everyone talked about work, and maybe that's the most honest legacy a baseball player can have. Because baseball, at its core, has always been a working man's game, even as salaries exploded and technology reshaped preparation. The essence remained the same. Someone has to stand on that mound and accept responsibility. Mickey Lolich did that more willingly than most. He never chased fear, but fear followed him, not because he intimidated hitters with velocity alone, but because he represented something pitchers and batters both understand instinctively: inevitability. If you didn't beat him early, you might not beat him at all. He wasn't going away. He wasn't tiring in the way you expected. And even if you got him, he'd still be there tomorrow, asking for the ball again. That kind of presence doesn't fade easily in Detroit. His name still carries weight, not the polished kind, the earned kind. It's spoken alongside memories of factories, long winters, and teams that reflected the city's resilience more than its wealth. Lolich fit that identity perfectly. He didn't try to symbolize Detroit. He simply embodied it. And in a sport obsessed with measuring everything, that embodiment is hard to quantify. So when historians debate his place, when fans argue whether he was underrated or merely properly remembered, they often miss the point. Mickey Lolich wasn't built for debates. He was built for moments when there was no good choice left, when the calendar said rest and the situation demanded effort, when the body said enough and the team said now. Those moments don't repeat often. When they do, they leave marks. In the end, Mickey Lolich didn't need immortality. He needed trust. And for one October night in 1968, and for many long seasons before and after, he was trusted completely. That trust is why his story still resonates, long after the cheers faded, long after the yard was cleaned up, long after the donuts were sold. Some careers shout, others endure. His endured.